Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong support of meaningful reform to FISA Section 702 and in strong opposition to a mere fig leaf, or even worse, an expansion of 702. Unfortunately, we will not know which of these paths we are taking until the conclusion of this debate. What I know at this moment is that the base text before us right now is completely inadequate. Although it has some perfectly fine provisions, it does not represent real reform. Some of the proposed amendments that will be coming up today would take us in the wrong direction. And changing the sunset from 5 years to 2 years does absolutely nothing to improve the bill. Ultimately, this legislation should only move forward if it contains an amendment to mandate that the intelligence community obtain a probable cause warrant before they search the 702 database for Americans' private communications. Some of my colleagues appear confused about how 702 collection works and what we mean when supporters of a warrant requirement refer to backdoor searches for U.S. personal information. So let's be clear about what we're talking about. FISA Section 702 permits the intelligence community to sweep up the communication of foreign targets located overseas. When these communications are obtained, they go into what is known as the 702 database, where all the 702 data is housed. If the U.S. government wants to target a U.S. person for foreign surveillance, U.S. person meaning an American or a legal permanent resident, they already can. They do this by getting a warrant under Title I of FISA, a separate and distinct part of FISA from Section 702. The government cannot target Americans under 702 because 702 does not protect the constitutional rights of the targets of the surveillance. Foreigners not located on U.S. soil do not have constitutional rights, so this is not a problem. What is a problem, however, is that massive amounts of Americans' communications are still swept up in 702 searches. If a U.S. person communicates with a foreign target, that American's communications with the target end up in the 702 database too. While we do not know precise numbers, we know that a vast amount of Americans' communications is swept up every year. The intelligence community is not supposed to search the 702 database for U.S. person identifiers like our names, phone numbers, and addresses without cause. Searching for Americans' private communications in the 702 database, communications the government otherwise would not have access to without a warrant, is the constitutional equivalent of conducting a warrantless search. But we know that the government breaks this law all the time, 278,000 times, in fact, at last count in 2021 alone. Officials are supposed to find it reasonably likely that a query will turn up evidence of a crime or foreign intelligence information. But that did not stop them from searching for protesters, politicians, and political donors, to name a few, without proper predicate. Because of these repeated violations, Chairman Jordan and I agree that the only way to preserve Americans' privacy and constitutional rights is to require the intelligence community to obtain a probable cause warrant when they want to search the communications of Americans housed in the 702 database. This is a basic tenet of the Fourth Amendment. Now, Chairman Turner stated incorrectly that the proposed warrant requirement gives constitutional rights to suspected terrorists abroad. Nonsense. The warrant requirement does not change any aspect of surveillance of valid targets under Section 702, nor should it. The problem is that when we surveil the Internet, we sweep up massive amounts of U.S. person information. And the warrant requirement we propose would apply the Fourth Amendment to that information, nothing more, and our Constitution demands nothing less. We have repeatedly heard some of our colleagues tell us that the sky is falling, that a probable cause requirement would end U.S. person searches of the 702 database. But there are no facts to back up these claims. We will be considering an amendment today to add a warrant requirement for U.S. person searches of the 702 database. This essential amendment makes exceptions for victim consent, cybersecurity cases, and exigency, that is, emergencies. Thus, the vast majority of these searches can continue without a warrant. But for the small percentage of searches of American communications that would be affected, the government should have probable cause to search their communications. It is simply unfair to ask the intelligence community to both zealously protect our security while also protecting the constitutional rights of those surveilled. American system of checks and balances exists precisely for cases such as this, where two considerations must coexist at odds with one another. For too long, FISA Section 702 has enabled the surveillance of Americans without adequate safeguards to protect our civil liberties. Americans need Congress to enact these guardrails. And with Section 702 expiring soon, we have a rare opportunity to protect Americans' privacy while giving enforcement the tools they need to keep us safe. I encourage my colleagues to vote no on this legislation unless a probable cause warrant is adopted. And I reserve the balance of my time.
I appreciate the passion of the speakers on the other side of the aisle, including the gentlewoman from Wyoming, but facts matter, Mr. Speaker. And this body must dispense with the notion that any of this, the ills that they've spent all this time describing, are attributable to the Biden administration. I will read you a quote. This is from January of 2018, Mr. Speaker. Quote, "I would have preferred a permanent reauthorization," just repeat that, permanent reauthorization of Title VII to protect the safety and security of the nation. By signing this act today, however, I am ensuring that this lawful and essential intelligence program will continue to protect Americans for at least the next 6 years. We cannot let our guard down in the face of foreign threats to our safety, our freedom, and our way of life. President Donald J. Trump. So, spare us lectures about the need for, I understand we're going to have robust debates about the mechanics and the nuances with respect to this particular bill, but spare us lectures about the need for a shorter runway and a shorter reauthorization when the former president, whom apparently the House Republican caucus continues to take orders from, made clear and abundant his desire for a permanent reauthorization of this program, with none of these reforms, by the way, none of them. Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman from Colorado reserves. Gentleman from
Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Let me thank the distinguished ranking member of the Judiciary Committee and the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Even in this time of 2024, we need this legislation to protect now one of the most revered civil rights leaders, Dr. Martin Luther King. Yes, we need legislation that would in fact protect someone who simply wanted to provide justice to this nation. And he was the subject of COINTELPRO, a horridly distorted investigation of his family, of his belongings, of his extended family members, of his wife, who I think at the time was expecting. This legislation is important to save lives. It is important legislation to ensure that our intelligence community, our law enforcement community can do their job. But it is not legislation that should be utilized to abuse the American people. So I rise today to speak of the concerns on H.R. 7888. It is a bipartisan bill to reauthorize an essential intelligence authority, Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, and other FISA provisions before they would expire on April 19th. But in doing so, we find ourselves being subject to the eye of the knife, if you will, in penetrating the personal matters of individuals that have no desire to do harm to this country. As we know all too well, expiration of 702 authorities would deprive our federal government of the necessary insight into precisely the threats Americans expect their government to identify and counter. We understand that. As highlighted and emphasized through federal administration, if we lost 702, we lose vital protections to the United States and its allies from hostile foreign adversaries, including terrorists, proliferators, and spies, and to inform cybersecurity efforts. But we're also acutely aware that 702 is an extremely controversial, warrantless surveillance authority that must not be reauthorized without substantial reform to rein in warrantless surveillance of Americans. We simply cannot do that. Indeed, warrantless surveillance intended for non-American targets located abroad inevitably has resulted in the collection and capture of Americans' communications. And yes, the results of capturing information that safeguards the American people and provides us with a safety net that we can fight for justice, fight for civil rights, and yet be protected. It is no secret that intelligence agencies have turned Section 702 into a domestic spying tool used to perform hundreds of thousands of warrantless backdoor searches for Americans' private phone calls, emails, and text messages. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, we have got, Mr. Chair, we've got a whole new world of technology where you can probe every aspect of our life. Yes, these searches have included shocking abuses, including against civil rights leaders, protesters, members of Congress, 19,000 donors to congressional campaigns, political parties. To protect the American people, we need to maintain the vital collection authority as intended to protect our nation and national security. We must do that while at the same time strengthening its protective guardrails with the most robust set, if you will, of protection that we possibly can. That's why I've joined with several members, including Mr. Klein, to offer the Abouts Amendment, and we will offer that as one of the Judiciary 3. This amendment does something Congress should have done 7 years ago, prohibit the government from resuming Abouts collection, a form of Section 702 that poses unique risks to Americans. Abouts collection is a collection of communications that are neither to nor from an approved target of surveillance. Can you imagine? Under Section 702 of the FISA, but merely contain information related to the target. It is unbelievable that we would go after innocent Americans, members of Congress, in the random searching, phishing. I thank the gentleman. The random search and phishing of information that may not be relevant. In the past, Abouts collection focused on collecting communications that include a target's email address or phone address or Twitter handle or something like that. But in theory, Abouts collection could be used to collect emails that merely mention a person who is a target of Section 702 surveillance. I rise today to indicate that we cannot pass this legislation without these vital amendments, and we cannot pass this legislation without the American people believing that when they pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, that they are pledging allegiance to civil liberties, freedom, justice, and equality for all. I rise to support these amendments and, as well, a free nation with democracy and liberty for all. With that, I thank the gentleman, and I yield back.
Chairman Cole, Ranking Member McGovern, thank you for inviting me to testify before you once again on the important topic of surveillance reform. As I've stated repeatedly throughout this process, it is long past time for Congress to rein in abuse of FISA Section 702 authorities by the intelligence community. Yes, there are already laws on the books designed to protect Americans from unauthorized government surveillance. But we know from our oversight efforts and the intelligence community's own reporting that these laws are often disregarded and are at the very least inadequate to keep this powerful surveillance tool in check. For example, under current law, intelligence officials must find it reasonably likely that a U.S. person query of the 702 database will turn up evidence of a crime or foreign intelligence information. But this is of little comfort if the FBI repeatedly and flagrantly ignores this and other rules designed to prevent government overreach, which we know to be the case. That is why a probable cause requirement, with reasonable exceptions, should be required to search for U.S. person information, such as an American's name or a U.S.-based phone number. Without such reform, I cannot support reauthorization of these authorities. The Judiciary Committee is tasked with reauthorizing Section 702, which sunsets next week. For over a year, we have worked on a bipartisan basis to study the problem of intelligence committee agencies' abuse of FISA powers and to analyze solutions for preventing government overreach while keeping Americans safe from those who would do us harm. We held multiple hearings and overwhelmingly passed bipartisan legislation to reauthorize Section 702 last December. Mr. Biggs' bill, which was co-sponsored by Chairman Jordan, myself, and many others across the ideological spectrum, was a balanced first step towards reform. And I want to thank Mr. Jordan and Mr. Biggs for being strong partners in the effort to achieve reform. And as Mr. Jordan mentioned, this bill passed the Judiciary Committee on a bipartisan vote of 35 to 2. I can't think of anything else that passes the Judiciary Committee but anything like that. But our attempts to reform and reauthorize Section 702 are beginning to appear Sisyphean. This is my third time appearing before your committee on a FISA bill this Congress. Yet not one of these appearances has resulted in the House floor vote. While I remain hopeful that we will eventually enact common sense measures to rein in abuse of of FISA Section 702 surveillance powers, I question the wisdom of repeatedly offering the same legislation and crossing our fingers that we will get a different result. This past February, I told you that while I didn't agree with the Speaker's approach of putting a neutral bill before the whole House and allowing Judiciary and HPSC to fight over amendments, I was still willing to play his game. 2 months later, nothing has changed. Except for a small change to the amendment process, the House bill still reflects a clear absence of agreement between HPSC and Judiciary. And as with last time, rather than employing any of the other options available to him, the Speaker would have us vote on all of the items of controversy individually. This strategy is so unwieldy that if 2 or 3 of the expected amendments are adopted in combination, there may be nobody who will support the bill, depending which amendments are approved. The modest reforms in the Reforming Intelligence and Securing America Act are indeed unobjectionable, but they are also so modest that they would prove ineffective, and we have the numbers to back that up. In 2021, in response to repeated criticism from the FISA court, the FBI instituted internal reform for U.S. person queries of the 702 database. While these changes forced a 90% reduction in noncompliance, the FBI was still left with an average of more than 200,000 compliance incidents every year. The FBI's self-imposed query restrictions did not prevent searches for over 100 Black Lives Matter protesters. They did not prevent the batch query of over 19,000 donors to an unnamed congressional candidate, and they did not stop over 278,000 other non-compliant FBI queries of the 702 database that occurred in 2021. The single most important reform we can enact to combat these abuses is a probable cause warrant requirement for U.S. person queries. One of the amendments you will see today would impose such a warrant requirement on searches using U.S. person identifiers, with certain reasonable exceptions, such as cybersecurity cases, situations with victim consent, and in exigent circumstances. This warrant requirement is the reform we need to protect Americans and to allow surveillance laws to continue to keep us safe while also protecting our essential liberties. It is simply unfair to ask the intelligence community to both zealously protect our security while also protecting the constitutional rights of those surveilled. America's system of checks and balances exists precisely for cases such as this, where two considerations must coexist at odds with one another. For too long, FISA Section 702 has enabled the surveillance of Americans without adequate safeguards to protect our civil liberties. Americans need Congress to enact those guardrails, and with Section 702 expiring soon, we have a rare opportunity to protect Americans' privacy while giving law enforcement the tools they need to keep us safe. But we don't have unlimited time to get this right. The extension to Section 702 that the House passed last December expires April 19th, 10 days from now. I stand ready to vote on this legislation so long as a probable cause warrant requirement is adopted, and I encourage my colleagues to join me in supporting real reform. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much for your testimony. We'll now turn to my good...
Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the ranking member is right. The vote was 35-2 on a major piece of legislation. That doesn't happen a whole lot, I should say, in our committee. So I want to thank our committee. I want to thank the members on the Republican side who worked so hard over the last year putting this legislation together. We had 3 individuals in particular, Ms. Lee, Mr. Biggs, Mr. McClintock, who served on a task force focused on trying to get this right. I think they've got a good product if, as the ranking member just said, the warrant amendment is actually adopted into the base text. I also want to thank the Democrats who worked so hard, and their staff working with our good staff on putting this together. Ranking Member Nadler, Ms. Jayapal, and several others working together to defend a fundamental principle. The Judiciary Committee is supposed to be that, I mean, we're all supposed to do this, but where it's really focused is the Judiciary Committee is supposed to be that committee that is determined to make sure Americans' liberties are protected. And I think the staff and the members have worked hard to put together a product that will do that if, in fact, this amendment gets added here in a few minutes. When the folks who started this country came together, they had it right when they created separate and equal branches of government. The checks and balances in our system are good. They protect our rights, our liberties, key principles. And we should adhere to that. As I said earlier, it served us well. This amendment follows that fundamental principle. So I hope we adopt it. And then if we adopt it, I hope we adopt the legislation. With that, I yield back our time.
Gentleman from